Good afternoon. Welcome to this recording of the fourth session of the Pastor's Lunch and Learn series hosted by Lutheran Social Services. I'm Christine. I am with the LSS Disaster Response Program, and today we're going to be talking about the basics of disaster assistance and recovery. So South Dakota has seen a number of disasters over the last few years, and we are still in the midst of COVID. So having a greater understanding of the disaster recovery landscape will be important when helping your congregations and communities. So starting with what is a disaster, I think we all have a good idea of what a disaster is, but official definition is that a disaster is a natural or human-caused incident that disrupts normal life. Some different examples of disasters that could happen. And in times of disaster, recovery efforts are varied based on type, location, and number of people impacted, experience level of those leading the response, and the available resources. So while many think a disaster is a one in a moment sort of thing, really a disaster can be viewed as a cycle, which we call the disaster cycle. And this is the ongoing process by which governments, businesses, and individuals plan to reduce the impacts of disasters, react during and immediately following a disaster, and recover after disaster has occurred. And so this phase, the cycle is split into 4 different phases: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. The mitigation phase is aimed at preventing future disasters or minimizing the effects of unavoidable disasters. So activities during the mitigation phase would include any activities that prevent or reduce the chance of an emergency happening or decrease the damaging effects of unavoidable emergencies. So examples would be insurance programs, flood-proofing basements, rezoning planning, or installing floodgates or levees, or even new building codes in earthquake-prone areas. Preparedness, during this phase, a community or individual prepares to handle an emergency. Activities would include any plans or preparations made to save lives or to help response and rescue operations. So examples here would include evacuation plans, stocking food and water, holding disaster drills, installing smoke detectors, or creating emergency packs. Response activities are characterized by life-saving activities and meeting basic human needs. And response activities can be either categorized as emergency or relief. Emergency would include evacuation, sheltering, and search and rescue. Relief activities would be medical services, food, water, shelter. Finally, the recovery phase focuses on restoring and redeveloping and revitalizing communities impacted by a disaster. Recovery is unique to each individual community, and it may last weeks, months, or even years. Recovery includes any actions that are taken to return to a new normal or an even safer situation following an emergency. Examples might include rebuilding homes, replacing items, dealing with insurance, counseling or support groups for survivors. And this phase is not only about the restoration of structures and systems, but also considers an individual's ability to rebound from their losses. Recovery, just like response, can be split into 2 time periods: a short-term recovery period and a long-term recovery period. Short-term recovery occurs as the response phase comes to an end and the community infrastructure, services, and vital life supports are beginning to function normally. Many of the emergency and relief agencies and programs completed their work and departed this stage. The focus of short-term recovery is getting the community or individual functioning again. Now, long-term recovery focuses on looking ahead to building a community or an individual back to pre-disaster levels And this is also the time that a community deals with unmet needs. Much of the work and expertise of LSS is in the long-term recovery period. And so this is where you'll see most of our activities and time spent. A thing to keep in mind is that there are no distinct lines where one phase ends and the next begins. These phases cross in ways that mean many are happening simultaneously. So a common question that gets asked is, how long does it take a community or an individual to recover from a disaster? Well, and unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule because each disaster is unique, and the length of recovery depends on a whole bunch of different factors. However, the principle of 10 is utilized by experienced responders as a general guideline for understanding the length of a response and recovery process. The principle of 10 uses the length of the rescue stage to estimate how long relief and recovery might take. And so each phase or each stage is estimated to be 10 times longer than the previous stage. So if, for example, rescue took 2 days, then relief activities would take about 20 days, and recovery would take about 200 days, so approximately 6 months. Now remember that these calculations are simply estimates on how long recovery may take. Other factors may shorten or lengthen this time. Previous disaster experience or an existing long-term recovery group can help shorten this time period, while economically distressed communities or aging infrastructures tend to lengthen this time frame. So moving into talking about navigating the disaster recovery landscape. And disaster recovery comes in many different forms. There are so many different agencies and organizations and groups that are active in disaster recovery. They can be categorized into 2 different categories, either voluntary agencies or governmental agencies. Voluntary organizations would include any faith-based, social ministries, community organizations, long-term recovery groups, businesses, individuals. And of course, governmental agencies would include your public services, federal agencies, state, county, and city emergency management. To better organize disaster services for survivors, voluntary organizations have coordinated under a system known as VOAD, or Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. It is a network to effectively offer their services. They are considered non-operational in that they don't provide direct services, but they do provide a network and a forum through which voluntary organizations can offer their services, as well as which through they communicate, collaborate, coordinate, and cooperate. They call these the 4 C's, and these are the guiding principles for how a VOAD operates. Now, a VOAD was created prior to, or in 1970. This was called National VOAD. It came up after, I believe, Hurricane Camille happened. What happened during that disaster is numerous organizations that serve disaster survivors did so independently of one another. And as a result, help came to survivors haphazardly as various organizations assisted independently. Unnecessary duplication of efforts often occurred, while at the same time, other needs went completely unmet. Information for survivors on different services was inadequate, and communication between the disaster agencies was very limited, and any coordination of services was negligible. So after that experience, a lot of the major voluntary organizations came together and created VOAD, and they are now National VOAD because they are the national partners who work across the country. But they built that system to better serve different communities and individuals after disaster. So national VOAD, you can visit at nvoad.org. South Dakota, along with every other state in the country, has a VOAD. This is South Dakota VOAD, and you can visit their website at southdakotavoad.org. And then many communities within our state have what's known as a COAD, which is Community Organizations Active in Disasters. Again, it's the same principle as a VOAD, but these are just local associations that bring together stakeholders interested in building better prepared and more resilient communities. One of the major ones, of course, is in the Southeast. It serves Minnehaha, Lincoln, Turner, and the Cook counties. This is the Sioux Empire COAD. There are hopes and plans to build additional COADs across the state in different regions, just to kind of help lead efforts after a disaster hits those areas. Now, federal disaster response has existed in one form or the other for the last 200 years. And in 1950, Congress passed the Federal Disaster Relief Act, which authorized the president to provide supplementary federal assistance by declaring a major disaster when the governor requested help. So the different agencies that would play a part would be FEMA, and the assistance mentioned from the Federal Disaster Relief Act comes through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they are responsible for leading the efforts to prepare for, protect, and mitigate against, respond to, and recover from the impacts of natural disasters. This is also the channel in which federal information and the assistance reaches the affected communities and individuals. There are 10 regions of FEMA, and South Dakota is in Region 8. Their headquarters are in Denver. Now, many state, county, and cities also have emergency management programs, and you can visit the South Dakota one and get information about how they respond to disasters within South Dakota. Another piece of the governmental agencies is something called a VAL, or a Voluntary Agency Liaison. These individuals assist in the coordination between voluntary agencies and governmental agencies. Each of the 10 regions of FEMA has at least one VAL, and most state offices as well as cities or county have a state VAL or a VAL at their level. These VALs would often attend VOAD meetings where they would communicate trainings, policies, or other pertinent information to the agencies, as well as listening to the needs and issues of the VOAD member agencies and bringing those back to the state or federal level for discussion. Now, there's a common saying in the disaster field that every disaster begins and ends locally, which means that what we mean by that is that recovery is from a disaster is going to begin locally, and it's going to finally come full circle and end locally. So each community is ultimately responsible for its own recovery. However, when damage and emergency response overwhelm the capacity of that local community, help can be asked for from first the state and then the federal government. And a disaster declaration is the process used to determine the amount of assistance needed from the state or federal government. Now, disasters can be classified in 3 different ways. They can be classified as undeclared disasters, and these are the most common types of disasters. These are usually high attention or high impact but low attention disasters, and resources are limited. So this would be an example of a tornado striking a smaller, more rural area, or places where there's isolated flooding. In both cases, the disaster causes a lot of damage to the area, but the local community has the capacity to handle the response and the recovery. In undeclared disasters, you'll have your local COAD, your state VOAD, and other voluntary agencies typically responding, along with, of course, city and county resources as needed. Now, a state-declared disaster happens when meeting the needs of the community goes beyond the local community's capacity to respond. The governor must declare a state of emergency, which provides the state assistance and resources to be allocated to the disaster. And just with undeclared disasters, you'll have a state, VOAD, and local COADs involved as well. Now, when a disaster strikes and it is so severe that the state and local governments together cannot provide the needed resources, is when the federal government becomes the resource for these resources, becomes the source for those resources. Emergency declarations supplement state and local or tribal government efforts. And this is through the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. A president has to declare a presidential disaster declaration for that area for the assistance through the Stafford Act to become available. And probably one of the most confusing things is disaster assistance. People are wondering what is available, how do I access it, what happened. So starting from the top down, disaster assistance from the government can fall into three basic categories: public assistance, hazard mitigation assistance, and assistance for individuals and businesses. Public assistance is funds used to repair essential public systems, things like utilities, roads, networks, things like that. That is a public service that everyone needs to function. Hazard mitigation grant programs provide funding to prevent damage in the future. So this might be grants to build up levees around a river to prevent flooding, might be installing different gates, could be putting up tornado sirens, different things like that. The one that most people want to know about is individual assistance. And of course, this is funding for individuals as well as small businesses. Now, FEMA offers different types of programs for individuals, and those things are like housing, unemployment, legal services, crisis counseling, tax relief, agriculture, disaster case management, and it can go on and on. Now, while some individual assistance funding is available through what FEMA calls the Individuals and Household Program, most disaster assistance through the federal government is through low interest loans from the Small Business Administration. These loans cover damage not covered by insurance for repairs or replacement of their residence or personal property. Renters can also apply for their own personal property, just not their residence. Businesses can receive SBA-backed disaster loans that are intended to repair disaster-related damage to the property or help replace inventory and supplies. Now, by law, federal assistance cannot duplicate benefits provided by other sources. So this would include insurance or other state, local, and voluntary assistance programs. So whenever a federal assistance loan occurs, they will subtract out however much a person received in insurance or through other programs. So these loans can be up to $200,000, and they're meant to cover the cost of building back exactly the same. And so duplication of benefits would just mean that they would have to subtract out insurance awards, or if other programs assisted, it would subtract out those dollars. However, it is, and many people think it's not worth going through the hassle of applying, but everyone must apply with the SBA for a loan. It's the first step in accessing any sort of assistance through FEMA. So failure to complete the paperwork can affect one's eligibility for other programs. Now, to receive a loan, they are going to have to demonstrate an ability to repay the loan. And if that's denied because they don't have that ability, applicants then become eligible for other types of assistance like federal grants, which don't have to be repaid. So it's really important that you fill out that paperwork, because many people automatically assume, well, I can't pay back this loan, that's too much, don't even go with it. Well, they could get funding, grant funding, to do these repairs or replace property. So if they skip out on that first step, they're going to lose out on a lot of assistance. And FEMA, of course, is notoriously a long and frustrating process to access assistance. However, advocacy is the key to dealing with FEMA. Effective case advocates can assist individuals in helping them clarify the circumstances surrounding a loss and help them communicate all of this to FEMA. Because it's confusing, but a denial from FEMA is not really a no. It really just means more information is needed. So after disaster hits, be your own advocate and advocate for others around you too. And so encourage them to register with FEMA, document any damage and repairs done, and keep the receipts, because those will definitely help improving your case as to needing the assistance to recover. So that's federal disaster assistance. As mentioned before, disaster assistance can come through other programs like volunteer agencies or your personal insurance. So there's a sequence of disaster assistance that can be difficult, or not. It's not necessarily understood by the common man. But the sequence of disaster or delivery assistance establishes the order in which disaster relief agencies and organizations provide assistance to disaster survivors. And the reason for this sequence is to prevent duplication of benefits, as well as maximize available resources and coordinate efforts to help survivors navigate the recovery process. So it begins with those initial services right during and after a disaster. So this is going to be voluntary organizations who help provide shelter, emergency assistance, medical needs, initial cleanup, and even mass feeding. And then the insurance is going to take over. So whether you have homeowners, renters, flood, fire, savings even, this is going to be the next step in disaster assistance. Now, if you don't have any of that, this step would obviously be skipped. However, those two things have to be completed before assistance through FEMA is available. And so they have some temporary housing, medical, dental, and funeral assistance. And then comes the SBA loans. So property loans up to $200,000 and personal property loans up to $40,000. And then the other programs might be group flood insurance, moving and storage, or some other needs that are available as well. Again, to be eligible for any of this, you must complete the SBA application loan. I cannot stress that enough. So make sure that you know this and you're sharing that information with others as well. And then finally, after all of that, any other sort of assistance would be provided by voluntary organizations. So again, the agencies themselves, or they might work together as a long-term recovery group to provide any assistance. This is typically when we see unmet needs in the community. The thing to keep in mind with this disaster assistance is that most disasters are undeclared, which means assistance through the federal government is not available, which takes out these three steps. So this 6-step process now becomes 3. You'll go through the emergency voluntary organizations, through insurance, and then again, voluntary organizations are asked to step in and help meet any unmet needs. 80% of all disasters are undeclared, so this is really going to be the sequence that is going to be used most of the time. Now, unmet needs is the gap that remains from resources available to the individual to address the disaster and the related needs to recover to reach the new normal. Unmet needs can fall into one of 3 categories. You can call them the 3 M's. Money or materials, which money is used to get the materials, muscle or labor, and mental health, which would be like emotional or spiritual care. Unmet needs can be addressed through long-term recovery groups and the voluntary organizations that are working in the community. So a long-term recovery group, I mentioned it several times, it is a community-based cooperative body working to assist individuals as they recover from a disaster. They provide a structure to identify needs within the community and find resources to meet those needs. They usually consist of representatives from faith-based, nonprofit, government, business, and community organizations. In a sense, it is very similar to a VOAD. However, it is very focused on the local community and serving the local community versus a statewide. A lot of times, the long-term recovery group has members who are also part of the VOAD as well too, which helps bring in outside resources from the community. But the goal is to ensure that even the most vulnerable recover in the community, and not just those who have insurance and who have the means and resources to bounce back. A lot of time is spent with a long-term recovery group to help those who have those unmet needs. Now, long-term recovery groups can be as varied in their structure as the communities in which they work. Areas of focus for long-term recovery groups are going to be dependent, of course, on each disaster, but some common areas are going to be donations management, construction management, resource development, emotional and spiritual care, sheltering or feeding, volunteer management, and then unmet needs or disaster case management. And an unmet needs committee is probably the most common group of or a piece of a long-term recovery group. And it really might be all that a community needs in terms of a long-term recovery group is to help identify the needs and find resources to meet those needs. Sometimes long-term recovery groups can include all the different topics, and so they might have a group who are focused specifically on emotional and spiritual care and working with the community to provide those services, or it might be on donations management. So you kind of get the idea. It's really a group that can be as unique to each community, or as unique as each community is. On the disaster case management, how that typically works is when additional resources are limited, a case manager works with survivors on collecting information and creating a case file. And then the case manager is the one who presents the case to the long-term recovery group to help the group fairly distribute the resources based on specific criteria and priority. So oftentimes long-term recovery groups might prioritize uninsured or underinsured families. It might prioritize single parent households, elderly, veterans, really any sort of vulnerability index can be kind of used as a priority for the long-term recovery group. And it's really based upon what the group sees as the most in need. And churches have often acted as hubs for civic engagement for all sorts of communities and have often been present and part of long-term recovery groups. And they can provide a myriad of different functions after disaster, including like food and shelter services, medical and personal hygiene facilities, transportation, childcare. I mean, the list goes on. And churches are effective for a fundamental reason, and that is they are familiar with and they care about their communities. They also have access either directly or through their network to unique resources and capabilities that are directly applicable to the types of services needed following a disaster. So, how can a congregation play a better role in disaster recovery, knowing that they are often counted on to roll up their sleeves and help after disaster, and that they have access to unique resources and capabilities? Well, the first way is to have the congregation and church be disaster ready themselves, because it's not a matter of if, it's a disaster will strike, it's a matter of when. So make sure your church is ready internally to respond to a disaster. So do you have emergency plans ready? Are they focused on different hazards? Do you know what your congregation will do if it is damaged by a tornado or damaged by a flood? COVID has been a new one that has really thrown, honestly, most organizations and agencies for a loop, just because we haven't seen anything like it in our lifetimes. So get yourself up to date with those emergency plans, because those who are internally prepared are better able to respond to the needs of the community should something happen. So rather, if you are prepared and are ready to serve those outside, you can use your own resources and people to coordinate a response rather than trying to stumble and recover yourself and respond to your own needs. Now, organizational readiness training is a tool to get your organization ready to respond externally to disasters. It does include information on how to prepare yourself internally as well. And so that is training that is available to work with congregations and communities to be disaster ready. Another way a congregation can play a role is, as well as pastors themselves, they can advocate and educate themselves and others. So a big piece is understanding the basics of the disaster response landscape. And this training gave you just a brief introduction to all of that. Honestly, understanding the sequence of delivery and the different types of disaster assistance it will take a lot more. I've been in this world for 3 years and I am still learning pieces of all of that. But the more you know, the better able you are to advocate for those around you. Knowing how to navigate that assistance and understanding how frustrating FEMA can be, and really that the process is through an SBA loan, and making sure people apply for that. And supporting those individuals as they go through that process, because it's going to be a long one. There are additional trainings in disaster response. We offer those through our group called the Midwest Consortium for Disaster Services. This is a program of Lutheran Disaster Response, in which LSS is a member of. But they have worked together in the Midwest to bring together knowledge and information and turn those into really good trainings that are applicable to the situation and to different disasters. Most of their trainings focus on the long-term recovery, so it's going to be trainings on how to build a long-term recovery group, how to do volunteer management, how to do disaster case management. Other trainings that are available, there are these unique climate resilience trainings. that are offered. These were developed through a preparedness grant, but they go through different scenarios of climate change. So extreme heat, extremes, and even extreme flooding. So these are trainings that are actually in the form of a game, where everyone plays a role, and there's a facilitator that goes through. But it's a great way to prepare yourself and your community for different types of climate change. And it does provide a good insight into pieces that are needed for consideration. And these are available through the hyperlink right there. And finally, the last bit is to coordinate and collaborate. Don't be a silo in disaster recovery. It's not going to serve anyone well. But congregations can build relationships with disaster organizations and programs. One way is obviously through the Synod and LSS. We are here to help you, your congregation, your community during, after, and before a disaster. So reach out to us with questions, with concerns, with, if you have interest in doing trainings, learning more about all of this. Help connect the right people to the right resources. As I mentioned, that churches have really unique resources and capabilities through their networks and through the church itself. And so use those connections to help the individuals in your community. You can build volunteer teams. These are trained disaster volunteers that can deploy when needed. So they might be skilled in cleanup, or maybe they're a chainsaw crew, or maybe they are knowledgeable in disaster case management, or emotional and spiritual care. But build those so when something happens, there are individuals already trained who can respond right away. What I mentioned before about being a silo kind of feeds into this idea of self-deployment. This is a common thing that happens in the disaster world, is untrained volunteers they want to help, and they go into a disaster situation without the knowledge of the partners who are helping in the response. And so this can, it's really a disaster waiting to happen. One, just if they're not trained on the right way to even use a chainsaw or to dispose of different materials that could be a hazard to themselves as well as others. And also goes back to the whole coordinating services piece. If there are groups that are unaffiliated who are just offering services, the VOAB, the COAB that are working in that area are not going to know that. And so it's better to work through the VOAB and the COAB than it is to just self-deploy and do things. Another piece is, while churches do really well quickly organizing themselves for relief services right after a disaster, it's the long-term recovery projects which tend to be passed over. But as you can see, that's when really a lot of the unmet needs is during the long-term recovery process. And so think about leading your community to set up a long-term recovery group or a COAD to be prepared before the disaster hits. Encourage your staff or congregation members to get trained in disaster case management so there is an individual ready to go when a disaster hits, rather than spending weeks and months gathering individuals, going through training to build a long-term recovery group or to be a disaster case manager. Have those individuals set up right away and think of the long-term recovery pieces of that. So that was a short introduction to the disaster world, as well as some ideas of how the Synod and congregations can be more resilient and play a role in the disaster recovery. I really encourage you all to think about your congregation's disaster recovery plans, whether they are internally or externally, and decide what role your congregation wants to play in disaster recovery. As always, LSS is your partner for this, so feel free to reach out to myself or others in the organization to discuss anything, or if a disaster hits, feel free to reach out to us and help bring in those outside resources. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for being a part of this training. And I invite you all to join us for the next part of our Lunch and Learn series, which cover the next 4 months. In May, we are going to cover refugee resettlement and what's new in 2021. June 8th, our topic will be grief and loss. July 13th, we will be doing organizational readiness training called Be Ready or Be Disaster Ready. So if today has interested you, I invite you to come back to all of them, but specifically the one in July. And August 10th, our focus is going to be on engaging parishioners with mental health issues and how to better serve them. So thank you once again. I hope you have a wonderful day and join us in the next couple months.